Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of the Father Talks podcast. I am your host, Mike D. Today, I am joined with Dr. Bruce Chalmer. Dr. Bruce is a psychologist, author, and couples therapist with more than 30 years of experience helping couples face betrayal, conflict, and fading intimacy. His 7-word relationship formula is simple but powerful, but be kind, don't panic, and have faith. Today, we're talking about what really breaks relationships, why communication may not be the main problem, and whether trust and passion can truly be rebuilt. Dr. Bruce, hey, thank you so much for coming on the show. I appreciate you.
Well, thanks for having me on. I'm really happy to be here.
Well, listen, 30 years. Wow. You've been doing this a long time.
I have, and if you do the math, we were just talking before, I'm 75, so I was not a kid when I got into it either. So I don't think I could have done this work when I was a lot younger. I needed more maturity, it seemed to me.
Right.
But I didn't really, so I didn't get licensed until I was in my early 40s.
Okay. So what brought you to doing this?
Well, in my past work, way back when, I was a statistician. Right
Okay.
out of college, I got a job and it involved me using statistics. I was an old math guy also in college in various ways. And so I ended up teaching statistics at the University of Vermont and really got into that. Ended up getting my PhD in psychology, but it wasn't on the clinical side. It was on the research side because I had just got a master's degree in statistics. They didn't offer a PhD, but I had done my thesis work in sort of a psychological area. So I ended up getting a PhD in psychology, interested in that stuff, but it was mostly from the standpoint of research and statistics and sort of understanding how to gather data and make sense of it. And I didn't get into the clinical work until somewhat later when my own then marriage ran into serious difficulty. Let's just put it that way. And, through that crisis, that's what got me into therapy myself. That's what got me to experience couples therapy. I now look back on it, some good, some bad, which is kind of the norm in life, isn't it? But that I was so fascinated by the process and felt like, wow, the stuff I'd done up to then was fun. I was okay at it, but this feels like a calling. This feels like, wow, this is kind of what I'm here to do. And so I ended up getting clinical training. Of course, I couldn't just hang out a shingle without training. So I got clinical training and I got licensed as a clinical psychologist. And I've been doing that for, 31 years since I was licensed, I guess.
Excuse me.
And in the past, 8 or 10 years, I've focused more and more on couples, almost exclusively couples at this point, because I've just been fascinated by the urgency of that work and inspired by what I see people, the struggles people go through and how much courage they put into it. I just find it very inspiring. And it's a great privilege to be invited into people's lives that way.
Right. And you know what? I've never been really big on getting counseling and, things like that most of my life. And I can tell you right now, after I had gone to counseling, and granted, this was for a different issue, but I can honestly say that it really helped me out. Having a resource that was outside of my regular circle. Somebody who was neutral, somebody who could tell me the things that, was wrong or, give me some focus. And I knew that information, it was just, hey, this is what I believe can help you. And let's try this, and see how that goes. And again, I used to be very against, going to talk to people about personal issues and whatnot, because they're personal issues. So
I believe the diagnosis there is, if I'm not mistaken, you have an XY chromosome. Do I.
Yeah.
And it's that pesky Y chromosome that seems to be the difference in terms of, whether somebody's reluctant to go to therapy or not. It's
Yes.
really just a stub of the other X chromosome. You and I have deficient second X chromosomes.
Okay.
And it's the part that women have that we don't have that makes people want to go to therapy, as far as
Well, I'm glad. I won't lie. I'm glad that I did. I know a lot of people who could probably use it, but hopefully they'll get there, because I have some friends whose marriages are on the rocks and whatnot. And I would love to see them stay together. And I think counseling might help them. So
Hmm.
that's part of the reason why like I'm doing this episode, because I want married couples, specifically, and men and men to hear, hey, it's not just them, because we often think that oftentimes that I'm the only guy going through this issue in my marriage or my relationship, So I would like to, you know, I'm really hoping that this resonates with somebody that, you know, gives them hope, and they say, hey, you know what, I think I want to try this.
Yeah, yeah, it is interesting, and I tend to be well, I tend to be respectful of everybody I work with, but that particular aspect of somebody who's reluctant and who's skeptical about it a bit, I have a lot of sympathy for that because I can see why you would be. You show up and you're talking to somebody you don't know, and I said my own personal experience. I had some therapy that was really good in retrospect, and some therapy that was really bad in retrospect, frankly, and everything in between. And I'm sure, look, if people evaluated my work, I like to think most folks would think I'm good at it, but some folks I'm sure were not happy with it. So that's how that works. But just to experience that, to first of all, to be willing to experience it, to take that risk, it's a huge risk. I think guys in particular, I made a video of this a few years ago. It's a video actually directed at women who are trying to get their guy to go to therapy with them,
Okay.
like how to get your reluctant guy to go to therapy. And because this is the story I hear so frequently, when I've got a couple, the heterosexual couple in my office, and it's almost not always, not 100%, but big percentage of the time, it's the woman's idea to do it. And if the man made the appointment, it's almost always because the woman insisted on it. And that phenomenon that the guy is reluctant, every once in a while I'll have a conversation with couples about in effect, how'd you get him to come? And it's often something like this. I wrote about this in one of my books, actually. It's often something like where she's trying and trying, and he's telling her the usual excuses we give, which are things like, hey, you're the one who's unhappy. If you were fine, this was the guy talking, right? If you weren't unhappy about it, I'd be fine. So you go get fixed. You go talk to someone. And the woman is just incredibly frustrated. And what is she thinking? She's feeling like he doesn't care enough to go. He's just dismissing my concerns. Does he even love me? All that kind of stuff. And what both the man and the woman are not saying out loud, because the woman doesn't know it and the man won't admit it, is that the reason he won't go is that he's terrified. And he's
Right.
terrified for good reason, because what he's worried about is that he'll lose her. He'll lose the relationship. If you go to therapy, either the therapist will just side with the woman because there is quite a bit of statistical evidence that we as a profession tend to do that, whether we like it or not. And I try not to do that, but there is that sense that it is heavily weighted sort of towards women's ways of thinking and understanding things. Or he would simply point out that to the woman, well, you're married to a jerk. Why don't you dump him? And the guy's worried about this for good reason. And when the woman can actually say, oh, wow, it's not that you don't love me. It's almost never that. It's that you're afraid that you're going to lose me. I can understand that fear. It's a legitimate fear. The problem is, if we don't go, you might lose me too. But if she can actually legitimize his feelings about it, maybe he'll actually listen to her. And
Right.
that's often what gets people in the office.
So, it's also, we were talking, why isn't communication the real problem?
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
I kind of feel like, I thought that was the big thing, is that we need to be better communicators, but now I'm here, that may not be the whole problem.
Yeah, I'm smiling about that one because that's of the 4 books I've written about these kinds of topics. That's the one with the snarky title. It's my snarkiest title. I'll give the subtitle too. The title is "It's Not About Communication: Why Everything You Know About Couples Therapy Is Wrong." Is that a
Okay.
snarky title or what?
Right.
So what am I? Yeah, what am I saying that? Because of course you're absolutely right. When people think about, gee, I'm having trouble in my relationship. We keep getting into fights. Anytime we try to talk about anything more controversial than pass the salt, we get into a fight, and sometimes even that. So it sounds like it's communications issues. Shouldn't we learn to communicate? And very often, I'd say it's substantial majority of the couples that show up in my office for the first session are saying things like, we need to communicate better. Can you give us tools for communication? And they're not wrong. I mean, I'm not, that it's not ridiculous, but I will note this. Usually, in vast majority of folks, they're actually very effective at communicating. The problem isn't that they don't know how to communicate. The problem is what they are communicating. They're
Okay.
communicating very effectively things like distrust, anger, resentment, hostility. That's what they're communicating very effectively. They don't need tools for communicating those things better. They need to not feel those things. And the problem is if you teach couples, if you spend time teaching couples communication skills, like, well, use I statements. You may have heard of that one. That's a classic. Or active listening. Make sure you understand what the other person said and repeat it back. And all these techniques that people can learn. All those techniques are based on good ideas because those techniques are what people do who get along well without thinking about it. If you're having conversation and enjoying it and relaxed, you're not insulting each other. You're listening to each other. You're actually trying to get a sense of what's the other one saying. And if you don't understand it, you'll ask about it. All that stuff that the techniques teach about. If you're not getting along, the techniques will not help you get along better. You'll just argue about how you're using the techniques wrong. So basically teaching those techniques is unfortunately worse than a waste of time, because it's not only a waste of time, it avoids actual intimacy. Actual intimacy involves, and again, I'm not saying be jerks about it at all. Quite the contrary. But I'm saying actual intimacy involves really being willing to say how you feel in a way that's respectful, but nevertheless honest. And that involves tolerating anxiety. That's scary. To be honest with someone about something that's been bothering you, or honest with someone about something you've been, thinking you'd like to try, or certainly that's true in the sexual domain, which often comes up. Somebody wants to try something, but they're worried their partner's going to think they're weird for even thinking about it. That takes a lot of courage to be able to bring up. And that's what's getting in the way of their communicating. So they don't need communication techniques. They need to learn how to tolerate the anxiety of being honest.
And you know what? And I would have never really looked at it that way, because I've always thought that I've, was a pretty effective communicator.
Mm-hmm.
But there have been certain things where I'm thinking, man, I really need to talk to her about this. But if I say this, it's going to turn into a fight, or
Yep.
it's going to be so many other things. And oftentimes, honestly, it was nowhere near as bad as I had anticipated it was going to be.
Which is you're fortunate. That's a good
Yeah.
thing.
So
What happens with couples where it doesn't turn out so well is they learn pretty quickly to either to walk on eggshells or to fight about everything else because they can't talk about what's really bothering them.
right,
And so they end up, I have my catchphrase for that is the death spiral for passion, because what they do is they end up shutting down their intimacy. And I mean intimacy in a very broad sense, not just sex, but more generally. They stop being honest with each other. They start, trying to craft how they say things carefully in hopes it won't set off the other person. It doesn't work.
right. Well, and I know that when we have communication breakdowns, you know, everybody's you start like you said, you start going, walking around on eggshells, but everybody's in their own separate corners. We go to one of us is on the couch, one of us is upstairs in the room,
Mm-hmm.
and I know a lot of people like that now, and they're just like going through the motions instead of getting some sort of help, or
Yeah.
instead of addressing what's going on. You know, I get it. You guys have been together 20 plus years, but what's the point of just being two people who live together, you know, and just constantly fighting? Well, we're together for the kids, and I've talked to several people, and the worst thing you could do is stay together just for your kids, because you're setting a bad precedent for them, because they're just going to repeat that cycle, staying in a relationship that, isn't going anywhere, you know.
Mhm.
So
Yeah. No, I agree with you. Yeah. Of course, I will throw in the other thing you could model for those kids is actually working on it in a way that where they will see that, oh, it's possible for a couple to have some problems and actually heal from them,
work
which is
through
a
them,
lovely
right?
thing to model for kids. Cause one of the things I like to point out about all of us is that we are all, all human beings. We're all annoying as hell.
Right.
Right. We are annoyed and we are annoying. And I mean to say that in a fairly lighthearted spirit because, you know, part of learning to be with someone, no matter how much you love them and how wonderful they are for you, you're going to annoy them and they're going to annoy you. And when you're doing well, those things are just funny. They don't rise to the level of, existential threat.
Right.
But when you're not doing well, it feels like every one of those annoyances becomes another reason why that other person doesn't respect you or doesn't love you.
Right.
And so
So,
those couples that are roommates sometimes need to work on that.
right. So, are we essentially saying that, these are all things, especially when it comes to communication, that they're all things that are kind of slowly killing the marriage?
Yeah. Yeah. But, the way I like to talk about it is, marriages, relationships in general need two different sets of needs to thrive. And the reason
Okay.
I separate the two different sets of needs is because they're somewhat in conflict. But one thing that every relationship needs, if you a long-term relationship, is stability. You want to feel safe. You want to feel secure. You want to feel like, when you wake up in the morning, you're not worried about the relationship. You want to be able to feel like your partner is fairly predictable and reliable. They'll show up when they say they're going to show up, accountable, that you can bring up things with them if something's bothering you and you can talk about it. All of those things are stability skills. Stability is all about keeping the anxiety level low, which is a good thing. Anxiety is, kind of by by the design of our bodies, anxiety is supposed to be bad. It's like it's a danger signal, right? So you want to minimize it, of course. The flip side, though, the other set of needs you need is intimacy, that sense of feeling alive. That's not at all about feeling predictable or even necessarily reliable. That's about being alive in the moment. And couples need that to feel alive with each other. And
Okay.
that's what I was talking about before in terms of being willing to risk the anxiety of being honest. And that's what dies. If people stop being willing to do that, then they show less and less of themselves to the other partner and they start feeling dead in the relationship. And, we don't tolerate that forever.
Right. And see, and I know with men, once we start getting annoyed with things, we already have issues with our communication skills. Okay. So once we start getting frustrated, like if, and I don't want to make this all, a one-sided thing, but I know generally once men get frustrated with things, with their significant other, we tend to withdraw, you know, you
Yeah.
start getting short answers. We start, hey, we spend more time by ourselves. You know, maybe you're a car guy. You spend more time working on your car than spending time in your house because you don't want to have to talk to the other person. Or, you're doing everything you can to avoid your significant other because you've just gotten to a point where you feel like, hey, there's no point in me even putting in this effort because it's not going to go anywhere.
Yeah. No, that's indeed. And, one of the things I think about guys is that it's not only that we're not great at communicating, especially about emotional stuff. We don't even know necessarily our own emotions. We know when we're pissed off, but not much else.
Yes. Right.
And
I do.
yeah.
And I can tell you, I can articulate when I'm mad and when I'm happy.
Hmm.
Anything else other than that, up into,
Maybe
and
horny,
I've
maybe
gotten better.
horny too, right? We usually
Yes.
do
Oh,
pretty good with horny,
good.
right?
Yes.
So
Absolutely.
horny, mad, and happy.
Absolutely.
That's pretty much our
Yes.
range. Yeah.
And hungry. And hungry.
And hungry.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
But, yeah. And that's the thing is that this is all of this, unfortunately, stems from men, from an early age, only being allowed to express, a handful of emotions. You know, even young boys, you know what? Hey, we're not allowed to lash out. We're not allowed to get upset, or when we do, people make excuses for it, you know, but other than being happy, being rambunctious, what emotions have you ever, I mean, even in public, have you seen boys just be able to be upset about something and, people be understanding? No, it's always boys don't cry. Knock that off.
Hmm.
Now,
Yeah. Yeah. I'd like to put in a word for that stuff, even though it is toxic in some ways. Do you know?
yes,
It is on the one hand, so sort of, it can be toxic where guys we don't let ourselves feel. And of course that leads to all sorts of problems. So I'm not knocking that. I will also note though that it doesn't mean we should be women, and I know you're not saying that,
right.
but it is, I think it's important. I certainly note this in working with men as well as women. Both men and women seem to want this, by the way, this recognition that no, most women who are in relationships with men aren't looking for a girlfriend with a penis. They're
Right.
actually looking for the guy to be a guy. And some of that stuff is part of being a guy. There's probably good evolutionary reason why it's turned out that way. You know, yeah, we're not the ones who are supposed to cry as much as women do. It doesn't mean we should never cry. That's not
Right.
good. The idea that we're not as inclined to cry as women are, that's probably okay, except for those guys who are different from that, which, and they got all kinds of stuff thrown at them because they're effeminate in that sense. And there's a whole range of ways of being a person. And so people who don't fit the gender stereotypes tend to get a lot of stuff thrown at them, which is, that's not good either. But just that concept that says, yeah, the solution isn't that we should become like women. The solution is that we should become like, men with a better range of understanding. I think
Right.
that's true of women as well.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is that now I've done I've done a few shows so far that where we come into this where we have this conversation about men being able to express emotion openly. The problem that I seem to I seem to run into a lot is that everybody says that a man should be able to express himself however he wants to, or women, or the women that I've talked to say, man should be able to express himself in a relationship however he wants to, and we should be, he should be comfortable with that. But so when it comes to, we'll use crying. When a man cries, he should be able to cry, and that's fine. But he should not be able to cry. He shouldn't cry too much. So there's already a limit to how much of my emotion I can express. I'm already struggling with my emotion, period. And now I have a gauge to how much of that I can show you
Yeah.
before it's too much for you.
Yeah. I mean, I think in a sense, such limits, I mean, they sound kind of nasty, but they always exist anyway. Do you know what I
Right.
mean? What it reminds me of? It reminds me of this. There's a lot of in psychological circles, therapy circles, you'll hear people talking about guilt versus shame.
Mhm.
And I like the distinction too. I think it's an important distinction. The folks I work with mostly, this is certainly true in individual therapy. When I've done individual therapy with folks, have way too much shame. Do you know what I mean? Because the difference between guilt and shame, guilt is when you feel bad about having done a bad thing, done something contrary to your own moral compass. You've hurt someone, you feel bad about it. That awful feeling of, oh, I shouldn't have done that. That's an important feeling. If you don't have that, you don't have a conscience.
Right.
Shame is where you feel like you're a terrible person. Like you don't, you want to hide your face because you're ashamed to show up because you just think you're horrible.
Right.
And that the folks I've worked with in therapy in general have had way too much of that. It's like, yes, they haven't been willing to, yeah. Ironically, one of the things that happens when you have too much shame is that you can't experience guilt in any way that's helpful to the person you hurt.
Ah,
You
okay.
know what I mean? If you're
Right.
overwhelmed with shame, because what it takes to actually make a useful apology, to actually own what you did and apologize for it usefully and try and make amends for it, that takes actually a solid sense that you're a decent human being. It's like, okay, we all mess up, but I am a decent human being that messed up. Yes, I feel terrible because I should do better. And I've learned from this experience and I'm really sorry. Those are the makings of an effective apology, as opposed to, I can't bear the thought of that I'm a terrible person. And, then what you're doing in apologizing is just requiring the other person to take care of you because you feel so bad. If you may know people who apologize like that, it can be kind of annoying. It's
Yeah.
like somebody messed up. You just want them to say, oh, geez, I'm so sorry I messed up. As opposed to, oh my God, I can't believe I did that. And, I'm such a terrible person. It's like, now I got to take care of you for you're the one who messed up.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
come
And
on.
you're the one who messed up. Right.
Yeah. And I can easily forgive the mess up. Oh my God, we all mess up. Who hasn't messed up? We've all screwed up on one way or another. So it's that the reason I got into that little thing about guilt versus shame, that notion that, well, yeah, men should be able to cry and women too. And like, should be able to show ourselves. But whatever too much means there's some kinds of sort of social norms around that if you exceed, you're causing some problems. That part of what you have to learn as a kid is to figure out where those norms are and not violate them too much. And that's more about shame than it's about guilt.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
You know,
I'm putting in a word for the very unpopular shame because it gets a bad name, but no, it's got its place too. We wouldn't have it if it didn't have its place, you know?
for sure.
Yeah.
So, all right, talking about marriages, and one of the things I know I was reading that you in your profile is about betrayal.
Hmm.
So, betrayal in a marriage, or just a relationship, can can a relationship ever recover fully from betrayal?
Yeah. So, I mean, I can answer that question by saying, well, yes, because I've seen it happen.
Okay,
So, of course, it's not impossible. I've also seen lots of relationships where they don't recover from betrayal. And,
got you.
part of the way I define recovery in that sense, I don't always say that a couple has to stay together to heal from a betrayal. Sometimes what they learn through the process of working through it is that they probably shouldn't be together. That
Okay,
there's a context for it, and could be as simple as, wow, you've married a sociopath, get the hell out, but mostly it's not that. That's rare. Mostly it's that, no, there was a context for it. Somebody did something that they feel guilty about, but it had a context. Maybe the context is that they're in a relationship that probably doesn't have what it needs. Very often, however, what happened we were talking earlier about that sort of death spiral for passion, they sort of lost that.
right,
And
right.
that's the context where some kind of betrayal happens. And I have worked with lots of couples that have healed from that. And what I find fascinating about that is the only way they heal from something like that is they end up in a relationship that's better than it ever was, because how it was is what led them into trouble. So if they're going to heal and stay together, and so many of those couples, when they do heal, express gratitude. I've never heard anybody say, "Hey, thanks for cheating." I haven't heard that one yet. But I have absolutely heard people say, "Thanks for precipitating the crisis. It looks like we needed one because look how much better we are now." I've heard people say that, and I'm always inspired by that.
That one, that to hear that, that would be yeah. In my world, that would be insane. Yeah,
Yeah, well, it takes a lot of work to get there.
right,
That's not People don't get there right away. That takes dedication and a lot of courage.
right. So okay, so for the for the partner who's who's committed to betrayal, where where do they begin in a- accepting responsibility, trying to make amends? You know, I'm sure everybody's gonna want to full throated apology and all that, but I feel like an apology just isn't going to be enough.
No, you're absolutely right. Yeah. No, apology isn't enough. An apology sort of it's almost like it organically happens as part of the healing process.
Right,
And it's not the answer. It's sort of like an indicator. It's like, oh, wow, you've just made an effective apology. You've done some growth, haven't you? If you think about it, for someone to make an apology, having betrayed their partner, let's say we're talking to guys mostly. Let's say it's the guy who did the cheating. So the guy's cheated on his wife, let's say, and he feels terrible about it. He thinks back to how it happened. The the couples that come in, or the guys that come in and say, "I must have been crazy. I was drinking. There's no way I should do that. I want to go back to how it was. I feel terrible. Just, forgive me and let's move on."
right,
They are not doing the work. That is not going to get them anywhere, because if in fact they were crazy, they got another problem. They got a much more serious problem, right? The vast, vast, vast majority of folks. In fact, I almost say this in the first session to every couple I meet. Almost. There have been a few exceptions over the years, but almost universally, I will say, usually about 20 minutes in, we've talked about stuff. They've told me a little bit about what's going on. I've given them my little bit about stability and intimacy that we were talking about earlier. Sometimes there's a little light bulb moment for them. It's like, oh, like you said too, like, gee, I hadn't thought of it that way. That's sort of a little moment of hope for them. And then
right,
I will say, well, in terms of stability, because we were talking about stability, there's one thing you obviously both have going for you. And they'll say, what? And they'll say, well, I know we're old buddies now because I've known you for 20 minutes. So obviously neither one of you is batshit crazy. You and they will usually smile, right? It's like, and
right.
sometimes they'll see things, oh, you haven't seen me at my worst. But what I mean by, I don't mean to make fun of serious mental health issues, but what I mean by that is they're not delusional. Do you know what I mean? They're not saying the FBI is controlling the signals in my partner's brain. That's nuts. They're saying they're having a lot of trouble. They get angry. They're not always reasonable. Well, they're human beings. Of course, I'm not always reasonable, especially when we're hurt or angry. So, but they're not crazy. And so that phenomenon of not being crazy applies to somebody who cheated, right? Even though he knew it was wrong,
Mhm.
usually there's a process that people go through to justify it to themselves, or they'll compartmentalize. The guy will think, well, if she never finds out, we've been roommates, and if she never finds out that I'm banging somebody else, why should, no harm, no foul, or whatever. And then comes to realize, ooh, then she finds out, he sees how much he hurt her, he feels terrible. All that is true. What it takes for the person to do with that, the one who did the cheating to do at that point, is actually have some self respect, believe it or not. They're going to have to say, well, I wasn't crazy and I'm not stupid. So there must be some meaning here. It was wrong. There's no question it was wrong. But I better look at what I was thinking and how we got there, because otherwise I can't make a decent apology. One of the most effective things I ever heard in terms of a couple working through this, and this is a rare phenomenon. Over 30 years, have I heard this 2 or 3 times, max, something like that? It's where, let's say again, it's the guy who did the cheating, where he says to the woman, and this also comes up in other kinds of betrayal, like if he's violent or something like that, where he says to the woman, you know, I'm terribly sorry. I know I shouldn't have done what I did, be it cheating or violence or whatever. But until I figure out what happened, I'm not, I can't promise, I can't be with you. I'm going to have to figure out what happened before I have any chance of giving you, first of all, an effective apology, and any chance of being able to really represent honestly that I won't do it again. That's an amazingly honest thing to do. Very rare phenomenon, because usually the guy is so distressed over the possibility of losing his wife that he won't say things like that. But that's something that she actually finds credible if he actually says that.
Right. Okay. So, and now earlier you mentioned that sometimes in these situations, forgiveness is more like it well ends up being people splitting up.
Mm-hmm.
And no, I've never I've never seen forgiveness as us not being together anymore.
Ah,
So
well, yes.
how is that forgiveness if obviously we can't work things out and still be together?
Yeah, well, what you've touched on is actually a big distinction that I make between two different ways of understanding the concept of forgiveness. And there's the way you just described, which is the usual way, right? I think more
Mhm.
often people say, well, if I forgive you, that means we're back together, right?
Right.
And I'm saying, nope, I'm defining forgiveness, and I did not make this up. There's a lot of people who think of it this way too. I'm defining forgiveness a different way. I'm saying no, and this is a quote I got from somebody, I think, in a 12-step program. I don't remember who it was. I haven't been in 12-step programs, but I've known lots of people who are, AA and such.
Right.
Um, they said forgiveness is an inside job. What does that mean? In other words, you can forgive somebody that you have no intention of restoring a relationship with. You can forgive somebody you don't trust at all. That forgiveness has nothing to do with them, really. It has to do with letting go of the obsession yourself. What's her name? The novelist Anne Lamott has a wonderful quote about this. A lot of people like to quote. She says, to not forgive someone is like drinking rat poison and waiting for the rat to die. It's like, no,
Wow.
you're drinking the poison. And what
Okay.
forgiveness is getting the poison out of you. So if you can get past that, then you've got a shot at thinking clearly about, okay, can I trust this person? That's a whole different set of questions. Can you restore trust? That's a relational question. That's like, what do I see this person is doing that would make me think I can actually trust them again? But forgiveness, the way I'm using the term, is really only about letting go of the obsession yourself. So you don't get, letting go of the trauma, really. When you process the trauma, it's like, okay, I wish you hadn't done that, but I can think of it now without freaking out. That's what forgiveness means. And
Okay.
I think that's an important process to do independently of whether you want to stay together with someone or not. Now, I will say, if you want to stay together with someone, you better be able to forgive them. Do you know what I mean? Like, I wouldn't want to live with somebody I haven't forgiven because I'm just angry
Yes.
all the time.
Now, here's the thing is that I've seen people stay together, and I've seen this on both sides where, guy's been, has cheated, the woman has cheated, and they say, hey, we're going to stay together. But every time something, I don't know, a moment gets tense, that thing from the past comes right back, to the present, and if I'm not mistaken, you cannot move forward if you're constantly looking behind you.
Yeah, that's the irony of that. I mean, that's in a sense what you're saying there is that yeah, they need to find forgiveness if they were going to want to stay together. And
Yes.
it's interesting because what happens when they can get to that place is it's not that they forget about it. It's not that it never comes up again. It's that it comes up again in a much more nuanced way because they'll have this sense of understanding. Imagine somebody who's been cheated on. If they've really forgiven the other person, what that means to me, one way of saying it is they're recognizing that, wow, even a good person, this person that I love and respect, it's possible for such a person to have betrayed another person. Like that's what my husband did to me, or that's what my wife did to me. So you could sort of say, well, I can't imagine I would have done that, but if I were them in their situation, influenced by what they were influenced by, given that our relationship was really rocky at the time, I'm not saying it was good. I'm not saying it was morally okay. It wasn't, but I'm saying I can understand it. It's like, gee, you get to that point. That's what it feels like when somebody's really forgiven someone. It's like, I can still respect you. I can restore you to respect. Now, do I trust you? Different question, right? You're not going to want to stay together with somebody if you can't trust them. But
Right.
so trust follows, that takes a lot more work to get there. But the forgiveness part, I think, is really important because otherwise it's exactly as you said, you're still traumatized. Anytime there's any suggestion of it, they're freaked out. Couples where one of them is the permanent villain and the other is the permanent probation officer. That's
Yes.
not a relationship you want to be in.
Yeah. And see, and I would have thought, trust and forgiveness are kind of, they would go hand in hand, but
Mm-hmm.
I guess I don't have any good answers. I want this for us to walk away with a clear understanding that, you know what, hey, you messed up. I want to work things out. Okay. But we, there are, I'm assuming like this, you would need almost like milestones. Okay. Okay, so we're going to go to therapy to work this out, to try to work this out. In therapy, I've learned, from personal experience that, hey, you have to accept responsibilities for, whatever issues you've caused. You've got to, if you're the cheating party, you have to accept your mistake. And then you kind of have to be willing to, be willing to have your partner kind of hold your feet over the fire a little bit, because,
Sure.
because you, you betrayed them.
But yeah,
And
that's that part, oddly enough, that part's usually not the hard part. I know this sounds odd, right? It's like, oh, the one who
no,
did the cheating is expecting that. And the
yeah,
one who was cheated on is angry as hell. And they're happy to hold the other person's feet on the fire. The ironic part is the person who is cheated on, it's especially early on, it's a very thin line between looking at the context and making excuses. And people often say, what do you mean? How was the relationship before? What does that have to do with it? He cheated on me. That was wrong. Well, she's absolutely right that he cheated on her and it was wrong. There's no amount of context will make something that is just clearly morally wrong okay, but it will make it understandable in a way. And so looking at the context is important, and both parties were involved in that one. So again, I'm not blaming the person who was cheated on for the fact they were cheated on, but I am saying they need to be able to look at how they were participating in the relationship as well, because that was the context that it happened in.
right.
And if they
And
can't do that, and I respect that. If they can't do that, they may need to get out of the relationship because it would just be too painful.
right. Okay. So moving forward a little bit, we're talking about, obviously sex always comes up. So,
Mm-hmm.
but what makes, so in these relationships, what makes like what makes intimacy feel like dangerous? Because there's been infidelity. So we obviously we want to get back to being able to be intimate.
Mm-hmm.
What makes that, now uncomfortable? Yeah, what makes it
Yeah. It's that I think that's related to the notion of trauma. When
okay?
you're still traumatized by, and people will describe this to me. I keep, I keep seeing her, or I keep seeing him, having sex with the cheating partner.
Gotcha.
Um, they'll just have these visions, and it's really painful. And to get past that really does involve processing the trauma, which is sort of a vague term, but it involves being able to think about it without freaking out. So to
Right.
the extent that, look, most folks certainly these days get together and they have sexual histories. So it's not like they need the other person to be a virgin,
Right.
or they're freaking out at the prospect. And I'm, again, not condoning cheating at all. I'm not, it's not a good idea for
Right.
lots of reasons. But the idea that your partner has had sex with someone else in the past is probably old news. That's nothing new about that. You knew
Right.
that when you got together, probably. Again, there are some exceptions to that, but most folks, that's true these days. So it's almost like being able to put the cheating in the context of, well, that was past stuff that I don't have to worry about anymore. So, and then indeed that is difficult at first because, it's difficult in the sense there's something unholy about it. You know what I mean? It's not merely wrong. It feels sort of unholy. It's like you violated some sacred understanding to
Right.
do that. And that is difficult to get past, but I think it's very much tied up in that notion of forgiveness. When you
Okay.
can get past the forgiveness, then that often makes it possible. I'll add one other thing, which is a really common phenomenon that sometimes is surprising to people until they go through it. If you have a couple where they haven't had much sex, and let's say again, it's the guy, it's not always the guy, of course, but let's say it's the guy who cheats, and the couple has had a really not much of a sex life for a long time often, and that's often the context, not always, but often. One very surprising phenomenon is that when she finds out about it, all of a sudden she wants to have sex with him all the time,
Right.
which is
Yeah.
it's almost like primate behavior. It's like our primate cousins do the same thing.
Yeah. So if somebody's
Yeah.
having sex with you now, I want to have sex with you too.
Yeah, yeah. You'd be surprised. You wouldn't think so. And they
No, not
sometimes
at all.
surprise themselves. I know. It's almost like she wants to stake her claim.
Right. So, and and I don't understand this. Why would it take? Okay, so you've been in a marriage X amount of years. Okay, you guys aren't having sex, but now that somebody has cheated, suddenly you want to have sex with your significant other again. How did we get here?
Yeah.
Because I mean
Well, I
that
mean,
is mind blowing to me.
sure. I mean, and look, let me be clear. That's not a universal phenomenon,
No, for
right?
sure.
But it does happen way more than you think. It's very common. So yeah, why would that happen? Well, one way of describing it is they were stuck. The affair blew things up,
Mhm.
and oddly enough, then they could be intimate. Do you know what I mean? Then that's like, well, there's nothing to hide anymore.
Okay.
So here you are, here I am. Okay, I want you. It's almost as simple as that. So it's still. I'm not trying to say, by the way, that woman the hypothetical woman I'm describing. I'm not saying
Yes.
she's happy about it. I'm just saying she often wants to have a lot of sex, and
Okay.
there's an element there of almost, oh yeah, well, I'm not going to let you go.
So then what? I guess that's what separates sex from good sex then.
Yes, I have a chapter in one of my books about that: sex, good sex, and sacred sex. Yes. When I talk about that, it's really about that distinction I was talking about between stability and intimacy. To
Okay.
have what I call plain old sex, which I define, by the way, as whatever you think it is. you know, I'm not. I don't get into specifics about, well, is sex by yourself, masturbation, is that sex? Well, it is if you think it is. Yep, a lot of people would call that in the domain of sex. But I mean, even with another person, does it have to be penetrative? No, whatever you call sex. Just to have plain old sex, you have to not be freaking out at the very notion. And that's where, folks who have experienced sexual trauma,
Hmm.
people who have been raped or otherwise sexually traumatized, that could be a real problem. Even with somebody that they love and trust, they can freak out if they've been sexually traumatized. So that, just for plain
Okay.
old sex, that often takes therapy to help people process trauma so that they're no longer stuck with it. So there's that. Now, what I call good sex, and of course, who am I to say? Depends on, it's in the eye of the beholder, right?
Depends who you are.
It depends on who you are. What I mean by that in general is it's not merely physical intimacy, it's also emotional intimacy. In other words, when you're actually present and honest with yourself and each other, which is my definition of intimacy. That we talked earlier about, if you're too afraid to be honest, then you can't be intimate. So being present and honest with yourself and each other, physically, emotionally, spiritually, however you want to say it, that's what I mean by intimacy. So when sex has that quality to it, it's not just that you're having nice feelings and giving each other pleasure, which is lovely. I'm not knocking that, but it's also this sense of creating something really solid as the two of you.
Okay. So
That's what I mean by
then,
good sex.
okay. So then what turns good sex into sacred sex?
Yes, indeed. Yes. It's almost like you've read my chapter, So, or to people who haven't read it, they could read it. So yeah. So what, again, by my definition, what turns it from a good to sacred, and it is indeed kind of cumulative, right? You gotta be pretty good at good before you get to sacred. What do I mean by sacred? It depends on what you mean by sacred, right? So the sacred sex, I think, is more about the sacred than it is about the sex. And here, I don't mean it with respect to any particular religious tradition. It doesn't have
Hmm.
to be like Western religious concepts of God. It can be like Tantra, which comes from India. The folks who practice tantric sex are often talking about this sense. It's where it's not just about the two of you anymore. You're involved with much bigger forces. And so it sort of transcends the two of you. And so if you're able, which again requires a whole lot of tolerance of anxiety, because it can be very scary to be that present, present with your own feelings, present with the other's feelings, present with the universe. I don't claim expertise in it, but I've read about it. I've written about it. I've experimented with it. What the heck, it's interesting. But that's what I mean by sacred sex. And
Okay.
it's the ability to have sacred sex. You have to be willing and able to be in awe, not just sexually, but,
Right.
in awe of God, in awe of the universe, in awe of however you want to put it. That's what I mean by sacred sex.
All right. So let's move forward a little bit because we were talking offline about the book. I know you said you had several. Let's talk about your most recent.
My most recent book is actually called The Passion Paradox, which is a
Passion Paradox.
workbook. The Passion Paradox, yeah, which
Okay.
is my fancy little, clickbait way of saying. That's what I mean by that death spiral for passion thing. It's that
Gotcha.
the fact that stability and intimacy are in conflict. That's what that book is about. That book is a workbook. So you get that book and it sort of puts you to work. You do exercises and you do a deep dive in your relationship and you diagnose where things are going wrong and where things are going right. And you learn some skills to address those things. And then you take action. So it's kind of a workbook that leads you through that. And I actually turned that into a video course as well called the Passion Paradox. And since we talked about betrayal, the book before that was called Betrayal and Forgiveness, How to Navigate the Turmoil and Learn to Trust Again. And I turned that into a video course as well. So that's available. And all these are available through my website,
Yeah,
brucechalmer.com.
that was yesterday, getting ready to be my next question. So, where can everybody find the books?
Yeah, it would be brucechalmer.com. If you spell my name right, don't put an S on the end of my name because there isn't one there. And I appreciate you didn't. You
I
got it
got you.
right. I appreciate that. Yeah, Bruce Chalmer, BruceChalmer.com. That's my practice website. Also has information about my books, my courses, all that stuff. Also put in a plug for the podcast that my wife and I do. My wife's name is Judy Alexander. And you mentioned that 7-word formula: be kind, don't panic, and have faith.
Yes.
That's why we call our podcast Couples Therapy in 7 Words. And
Okay.
as you do, we like to interview guests and we have a lot of fun doing it, which is why we do it.
Outstanding. Well, Dr. Bruce Chalmer, thank you for Thank you for an education. Listen, learn. I always get all, frazzled, when I come to the end of the episode because there's so many things still that like questions and, listen, we're, as soon as we're done, I'm going to follow up with you and see if we can do another episode sooner than later because
I would be delighted. This
there
is
are
fun.
still a ton of questions. And,
Mm-hmm.
and honestly, I'd like to, check out the book so I can, well, check out the book a little more in depth than I already have. But I really want to, dive into it because I have a ton of questions, and I know a lot of people who are they're in relationships now that their marriages are on the rocks.
Hmm.
And I would love to be able to maybe insert some advice, maybe point them in the right direction. Hey, I'm like, hey, I had this conversation with Dr. Bruce Chalmer. He said, hey, check this out. And maybe hell, even send them your way, because I hate to see people, 20 years of marriage, but let it all go over just not being able to communicate anymore.
Yeah.
Or,
Yeah.
or there was somebody had a hiccup of some sort, it doesn't even necessarily, let's say it didn't even go as far as actually, infidelity, but,
Hmm.
you were talking to somebody else, you know, that in and itself is a sense of betrayal for some people.
Sure.
And, so it's conversations like these that, I really want to really try to put out there as much as possible. I know some people are going to still, not people, some men are going to still be resistant to, talking to somebody, but I want them to, you know, to hear these conversations and, what, save themselves, from a sinking ship.
Absolutely, and that
Yeah.
I'll put in those video courses I did actually are especially good for people who are somewhat reluctant to do therapy, either
Yes.
because of the fears I talked about, or even something as simple as cost.
Right.
Video courses are a lot cheaper than the courses of therapy are. So
Okay. Yeah. And see, and the cost of things is, everybody's going to, have something to say about. So, but
absolutely, yeah.
hey, Dr. Chalmer, thank you so much. I appreciate your time. And again, like I said, we are definitely going to follow up again after this. Could you give us the website one more time?
BruceChalmer.com.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, don't let your relationships, lapse. Don't just quit. There's help out there, man. That was actually really directed to you. All right, Dr. Bruce, thank you so much. I appreciate you. Have a
Thank
great
you.
day.